So I will be talking more about the Romanian text and especially about the grammar of Staicu within the context of other Romanian grammars from the 18th century in order to see the evolution of this terminology. First, I will start with some notes which at this point are no longer necessary since my colleague presented it more than well. I would like just to point out one thing, namely that both manuscripts of Staicu's grammar also contain Slavonic Romanian lexicons, and that these lexicons have been digitalized and edited within a project at the University of Iași, within the eRomlex project. Again, I'm not saying anything new by saying that this Slavonic text is based on Smotrytsky Slavonic grammar. I will point out that the text of Smotrytsky's grammar had already enjoyed some popularity within the principalities. The Moscow edition of 1648 was known to have been in the possession of the Stolnik Constantin Cantacuzino, who annotated it personally. Anthim the Iberian, Antimi Viranul, the then not yet Metropolitan of Wallachia, printed another edition of Smotrytsky's text in Snagov in 1697, and of course in Râmnic, at the orders of the Serbian bishop Petar Nenadović, yet another edition was printed. Again, this was mentioned in my colleague's paper. Now, the two earliest grammars of the Romanian language, and I would like just to point out a difference in terminology. Staicu's grammar is the first grammar in Romanian, but not the first grammar of the Romanian language. These will have to wait until the 18th century. And the two earliest of them, which were conserved only in manuscript form, were one by Dimitrie Eustatievich of Brașov in a manuscript text from 1757, which was edited in 1969, and another one was by the hieromonk Macari of Dragomirna from 1772, which he did intend to print. He even made a fancy title page dedicating it to Catherine the Great. However, he was unable to finish his project. This was discussed in two doctoral theses, both of which promised an edition. That edition does not exist yet, so I had to check the manuscript myself. Now, here is something that my colleague has already mentioned, but I thought I might as well give you the quote as well, namely how quickly he finishes with the numerals. And he says, "De numele numărătoare ai de destul în gramatică către care te trimet și între alte lucruri care aici n-am spus. Acum de aceasta ajunge de partea aceea de întâi a numelui." So I've said enough about the numerals. Just go to the grammar I sent you to, which is probably Smotrytsky's grammar. And now this is enough for the noun. And this shows that obviously this text was meant to be an auxiliary didactical material. What is interesting about this text from the Romanian's point of view is that this is the earliest example of a Romanian grammatical terminology by nature of it being a translation of a grammatical text. And we can assume that the terms were created ad hoc, that they were created based on the needs created by this text itself. And we may have some proof of that due to the fact that on folio 219 recto, we have this list of a small list of terms with the Romanian translations, even sometimes with multiple options being given. And I will focus on these a little bit more. Because what is to be noted is that these were written later. This is a later hand which adds these terms. They are obviously in the translation, but whoever added those notes wanted to have them in a more or less synoptic table. Of course, he doesn't cover everything. Now, we will see that this writing, which you can see is quite different from the one on the small bit, which can be seen on the left. This writing, we will see, is the same one that does interlinear notes throughout the manuscript. Again, with translation variants, because there was no dedicated terminology at that point, and it could always be improved on. You can see he has a list of parts of speech, which are in the top half. And at some point, he wants to write narrație, the word for adverb, and then realizes that it's not its turn yet because they were ordered by flexible and inflexible. He cuts it, he puts the last flexible form, the last flexible part of speech, and then continues the list as it should be. So he was quite particular about it being according to the order from the grammar. Now, what is to be noted is that the bottom part has information on orthography, which is phonetics, which in the grammar proper is discussed very, very quickly. It's done in like a couple of lines. And here we have some terms like what the word for vowel is, what the word for consonant is. So clearly he was trying to fill in some blanks that he thought were necessary. Now, on the first two lines of this folio, which is between the introduction and the beginning of the grammar itself, we have some translations for, first, imenitelni padej, the nominative case, which he says is numitoare cădere, and for imea narițatel noe, which he says is nume numit sau înnumit tot de ce feliu, so named or agnamed, name of all kinds. And these translations, the translations for the nominative, are consistent with the choices made by Staicu himself. However, those for the common nouns, we will see, are different from Staicu's options. First of all, these alternative translations can be seen in the text proper. First, on the Slavonic side of the text, because the text is on one page Slavonic, on the other page in Romanian, so it's not strictly parallel on the same folio. And in an interlinear note, he adds above narițatel noe, nume numit sau înnumit, grăit, chematoriu. So he also adds spoken and calling. So it's a calling noun. And an additional comment is written in the marginal note, where he explains what narițatel means. Numit cu o numire. So named with a naming. And this is, of course, the translation of the name adjective itself, which is why it's given in the masculine and not in the neuter, which would have agreed with imea. On the opposite page, he gives the same translation, again, above the equivalent for narițatel imea, which in Staicu's version was poreclitor, a nicknaming name. And again, he says, nume numit sau înnumit, grăit, chematoriu. He doesn't do this kind of mirrored gloss throughout, but we still have a lot of interlinear notes which show that this was more or less a work in progress. And on the subject of works in progress, I now move on to the second part of my presentation, which is dedicated to comparing the terms for various, let's say, morphological units, morphological terms, between Staicu's grammar, the grammar of Dimitrie Eustathievich in 1757, the grammar of Macari in 1772. These two were based on Smotrytsky's grammar. And finally, the grammar of Ianache Băcărescu from 1787, which is notable for introducing words of Italian or Latin origin. And also for the, let's say, for the final purpose of comparison, I will also add the modern Romanian terms, because what is different between Romanian and the majority of Slavic languages is that our terms tend to be simply from Latin, they tend to be neologisms. So this showed that there was a change in, let's say, the methodology of creating a terminology. Băcărescu's grammar is not based on Smotrytsky, it's based on an Italian grammar, on Lezioni di Lingua Toscana, and, as he says, on two Greek grammars. Now, first I have discussed parts of speech. So the noun, the pronoun, the verb, the participle, which is a part of speech, the adverb, the preposition, the conjunction, and the interjection. I will obviously not read all the variants over here, but you can already see in Băcărescu's side that it sounds distinctly Italian. Yes, you can see he says nome, he says pronome, and so on. Meanwhile, Staicu is, let's say, tends to calc after the Slavonic text. And you can see that many of the terms that Staicu uses are also used by Eustathievich or Macarian, with slight changes. Now, I will move on to the terms used for grammatical cases. And again, I will be comparing the four Romanian grammars. Obviously, there is one caveat. The Romanian grammars will not mention the instrumental and the locative because Romanian does not have these cases. I would say they reflect simply the cases that we had in Romanian, but to be fair, Băcărescu also adds, if I'm not mistaken, the ablative, because we are a Latin country, so we should have an ablative even though we don't have one. It is absolutely logical. And obviously, again, the terms we'll see change over time, especially until Bucharescu's time, but they all agree in using the word cădere, which is, of course, derived from padej and ptosis, and which is different from the current Romanian word, which is caz, from casus. And here you can see, again, the cases, as I said. Usually, you can see that Bucharescu uses the Latin terms, but still keeps, let's say, the traditional terms. By now, they were more or less traditional, so he uses numitoare cădere. You can see dătător being used throughout for the dative, the case that gives. You can see there is a change concerning the accusative case. You have vinuitor, but then you also have pricinuitor, both of which mean the same thing. And so on. You also have the vocative, which please remember because it will become relevant at the end. Oh, and one final note to make about this. Yes, so obviously no instrumental, no locative in the other grammars. And again, you can see Bucharescu gives these variants and they are given with an or. So nominativă sau numitoare cădere. Yes, there is one more note. Please note that the versions that Staicu gives are in the masculine. They're masculine forms. Mm-hmm. Every other version is feminine. So numitoare, nominativă, genitivă, and so on. Why is this? Normally, it should have been numitoare cădere. You saw this, in fact, in the small inscriptions. And the answer for this is probably that the translator looked at the Slavonic text, he saw imenitelny padej, he saw imenitelny, he saw that it's a masculine, and he said, okay, I'll put the masculine. He didn't think, wait, it's supposed to agree with cădere, and cădere isn't a masculine like padej. So he has these moments where he is, let's say, fascinated by the Slavonic text and follows it a bit too loyally. Now, moving on, just as I'm starting to run out of time, I'm starting to talk about tenses. Again, the matter of tenses was discussed in a small measure by my colleague, so some things will sound familiar by now. The point being that here, unlike with cases, all grammars, with one exception, have the same number of tenses, as there are 6 tenses in total in Smotrytsky's grammar, and generally in the grammars of these time, namely the present and the future, and 4 past tenses. And that is perfectly okay, because even in modern Romanian, we have 4 past tenses. So normally here, we should expect some terminological agreement between them. However, we will see that there are some problems. So let's say the present is not an issue, although you can see that the terms do change, and I will discuss them in a bit more detail in a second. You will notice here on the modern Romanian side that I have written some initials between brackets. The reason for that is that between Macarie, between Eustathievich and Bucharescu, there is some disagreement on which one is the composite perfect, which one is the simple perfect, based on their examples. So they clearly translate the terms which existed in older grammars. Especially, you can tell this from the nepredealnoie, from the indefinite past. So you can see that this is supposed to be the same term, but they understand them differently between each other. As you've probably already seen, Staicu does not give us much to work with in terms of how he translates the past tenses, because to him, they are all the same thing. They're all the past composite. And from what I've heard, it's a problem that Romanian students have even today. They just tend to use the past tense, the composite past tense for any kind of past thing when they translate from French and other such languages which have more complex or equally complex tense systems. Mm-hmm. Concerning the terms and their translation, Staicu is different from the others, because here he is trying to translate the exact terms used in his Slavonic text. So when he sees prehoditi, when he sees preiti and mimoiti, he uses words derived from the verb a trece, to pass, which at least will count to some extent as calques. Of course, they are not perfect calques, but he is making an effort. Meanwhile, Eustathievich and Bucharescu use a different tradition, which at least I recognize as being the one that I've seen in modern Bulgarian, which is to use the adjectives derived from a săvârși, to finish. So he has săvârșit they have săvârșit or săvârșitoriu, so perfect. Compare with minalo svârșeno. And you have nesăvârșit, nesăvârșitoriu, imperfect. Compare with nesvârșeno in Bulgarian. Now, the syntax used by Eustathievich and Văcărescu for the pluperfect equally contain adverbs emphasizing that the action was long ago. So they say mult trecută, or even more in the past, și mai trecutul. So there's a past action, then there's an even more past action to make it as clear as possible. And of course, there is one puzzling element, namely that Văcărescu describes the pluperfect as an imperfect tense, both in the Italian form, imperfectu, and in the Slavic form, nesăvârșitoriu. And I have no idea where he got this from. There is no reason to consider that the pluperfect is anything but very much a perfect action. Finally, Macaria is very interesting because he introduces completely new terms. So he uses temporal adverbs and adds the Slavic suffix nik. So, for example, now present is acum nik, the now tense. And the past tenses are all derived from adverbs meaning once long ago. So, de ună zi gave de unăznic, dinioară gave de neornic, odinioară gave odinioarnic. Again, he was doing his best and it was creative, it didn't stick. And finally, as I've already mentioned, all of them agree that the fact that one of the tenses is called nehotărât. The only exception is Eustathievich, who omits this past tense altogether. And the reason is given by the examples that they give. Now, again, the imperfect and the pluperfect are fairly unproblematic. They almost all agree that they are equivalent to the imperfect in Romanian, on modern Romanian, and the pluperfect in modern Romanian. Where the problem is with the past simple and the past compound past, which I've already mentioned. So Macaria says the past simple, denaurnic, is vrui, vruș, vru, so the past simple. The indefinite is am voit, ai voit, a voit, the compound past, which I remember is pretty much how it works in Bulgarian as well. So the indefinite past is the one that is composite. Văcărescu has them the other way around. He says the indefinite past is a simple past like avui, avuș, avu, and the săvârșitoriu, the past simple, is am avut, ai avut, a avut. And Eustathievich omits the indefinite past completely, but that is because he doesn't give any simple past examples in Romanian. So nothing like vrui, vruș. And this might be a dialectal feature. Of course, my colleague may contradict me. At the very least, in modern Romanian, there is this very clear sense that the past simple is very regional, and it might be that he himself didn't use the past simple as much, being from Brașov. Nowadays, it's limited to Oltenia, which is that part of Romania, which was taken by the Austrians in the 18th century and was returned 20 years later after another peace agreement. And Staicu, as I said, and as my colleague said, just uses the past composite. Everything is am citit. And now I'm handing towards the concluding example, and I will be done. An example which has nothing to do with these grammars in particular. It is not a grammatical text. It is a literary text by Dimitrie Cantemir, the Moldavian prince, called Istoria Hieroglifică, the hieroglyphic history, which is an allegorical depiction of the dynastic politics of Wallachia and Moldova, where the characters are represented through animals. And I will not delve into the historical significance, the historical accuracy, the literary value. What is important here is that there is a pun, there is a wordplay. Because at some point, the ostrich, who is identified with Mihai Racoviță, is asked, cum te cheamă? Which means, what is your name? But let's say literally, it means, how do they call you? This is the current Romanian expression. And of course, the ostrich maliciously interprets it as he wishes. So he says, I never call myself anything. And then he adds, did you not read your grammars where it is shown that the pronoun I does not have a vocative case? However, others call me OU. And as you can see, he uses the terms în locul numelui, so instead of the name, and căderea chemătoare. But of course, this shows that these terms were in use. And here I explained the whole wordplay. Unfortunately, it was not as difficult as I thought. But what is important, or what is equally interesting, is that at the end of the hieroglyphic history, you also have something known as a list of hieroglyphs, because Cantemir gave us a roman à clé, but he didn't want us not to identify who he was making fun of. So he adds explanations, of course, for the various animals. Yeah, be careful, the ostrich is Mihai Racoviță, and so on. But included among these hieroglyphs is a gloss for căderea la gramatică, the case in grammar, to which he adds the following definition: Slovenește padej, so in Slavonic padej, Latinește casus. And thus it could be argued that the Romanian translation of Smotrytsky's grammatical terminology circulated in the Romanian principalities as at the turn of the 18th century. It was not an isolated phenomenon, because it clearly was known to Cantemir when he wrote his text. And it should be emphasized that Staicu's terminology was still in use, albeit refined in various ways, in the second half of the 18th century in the grammars of Eustathievich and Macarie, several decades after Cantemir's time, but just before Bucharest, who had the idea to start using Italian and Latin words. Thank you for your attention.